The invasion of Vekta and the landing of the Helghast forces on the ISA colonies introduces the lore of the shattered peace of the Alpha Centauri. This is the moment where the Cold War of the stars turns into a solar holocaust, representing the orbital sovereignty of the Helghast. The lore suggests that the Helghast are not just invaders, but exiles returning to claim a birthright stolen by the Earth-backed ISA, representing the interplanetary sovereignty of the Vengeance. For Captain Jan Templar, the opening bombardment is the lore of the collapse of the colonial security. He finds that the advanced technology of Vekta is useless against the industrial brutality of the Helghast. This is the lore of the Steel Rain, where the planet becomes the sacrament of the trench warfare. It proves that the ISA defense force was blind to the hate, turning the Vekta city streets into a casket of the diplomatic failure. The lore of the Helghan history and the solar exile provides the lore of the biological divergence of the outcast. After losing the First Helghan War, the original colonists were banished to the toxic, resource-poor planet Helghan, representing the environmental sovereignty of the mutation. The lore suggests that the harsh atmosphere and heavy gravity turned them into a new species with leather-like skin and respirator-dependent lungs, representing the atmospheric sovereignty of the Helghan. This is the lore of the birth of the master race. It suggests that hardship is the foundry of the power. This represents the evolutionary sovereignty of the Scholar Visari. The lore of the gas mask is the lore of the industrial uniform. It hides the human face to reveal the weaponized identity, turning the biology of the soldier into a sacrament of the resilience, where the man becomes the engine of the state. The encounter with Luger and the Shadow Marshal Division introduces the lore of the invisible war of the ISA. Luger, a former lover of Templar and a specialist in assassination and infiltration, represents the subversive sovereignty of the intelligence. Her lore is defined by the sovereignty of the knife in the dark. She does not hold the line. She bleeds the enemy from the inside, representing the tactical sovereignty of the Shadow Marshal. This is the lore of the cold utility. It suggests that peace requires the acts of the cowardice performed by the brave. This represents the clandestine sovereignty of the Vekta. The lore of the Shadow Marshal is the lore of the necessary evil. You must kill the leaders to save the followers, proving that your sovereignty is precise. This highlights the moral ambiguity of the special ops, turning the infiltrated base into a sacrament of the silence. The lore of the Helghast Blitzkrieg and the SD platforms provides the lore of the mechanical betrayal of the Vekta. The Helghast victory is secured by sabotaging the strategic defense platforms from within, representing the traitorous sovereignty of the General Atoms. The lore suggests that the greatest shield of the planet was lowered by a hand of its own people. This is the lore of the internal rot. It suggests that technology is a weakness if the loyalty is purchased. This represents the political sovereignty of the sabotage. The lore of the SD platform is the lore of the falling sky. It turns the orbital laser into a sacrament of the execution, proving that your sovereignty is vulnerable to the greed. This highlights the fragile nature of the colonial power, turning the command center into a casket of the strategic hubris, where the protectors become the targets. The introduction of Rico Velasquez and the heavy weapons doctrine introduces the lore of the brutal honesty of the frontline. Rico, a survivor of a slaughtered squad, represents the physical sovereignty of the direct confrontation. His lore is defined by the sovereignty of the chain gun. He does not think, he overwhelms, representing the destructive sovereignty of the infantry. This is the lore of the unfiltered rage. It suggests that diplomacy is dead, and the only language left is the caliber of the bullet. This represents the visceral sovereignty of the grunt. The lore of the heavy gunner is the lore of the human tank. You must stand in the open to close the gap, proving that your sovereignty is resilient. This highlights the sensory overload of the war zone, turning the trench combat into a sacrament of the attrition, where the hero is measured by the body count. The presence of the Helghast propaganda and the voice of Visari introduces the lore of the oratory sovereignty of the autocracy. Throughout the ruins of Vekta, the giant screens and loudspeakers broadcast the manifesto of the Scholar Visari, representing the psychological sovereignty of the great leader. The lore suggests that Visari did not create the anger. He gave it a voice, representing the charismatic sovereignty of the fascism. This is the lore of the collective will. It suggests that the individual is nothing compared to the glory of the Helghan. This represents the sociological sovereignty of the state. The lore of the prophecy is the lore of the inevitable conquest. It infects the mind before the bullet hits the heart, proving that your sovereignty is intellectual, turning the war into a sacrament of the faith, where the enemy is a holy crusader. For the Templar of the opening parts, the world is the testing of the tactical sanity. You realize that the world is being replaced by the steel. The lore suggests that Jan is the logic in the chaos. You are the only mind that coordinates the misfits to hold the line. The city is not a home. It is a grid of the kill zones that you must navigate with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the gathering of the squad so vital. You are building a republic out of a medic, a spy, and a brute. You look at the Helghast flag, knowing that it is the only banner that the history has left to shadow the Vekta. The Golden Age is a silence between the mortar rounds, and you are the only will left to lead the defense of the last bastion. As this first segment of the history concludes, Templar stands in the ruins of the ISA headquarters, the smoke of the invasion filling the sky. Behind lies the shattered piece of the Alpha Centauri. Before stands the mystery of the traitor and the gathering of the four heroes. The air is no longer tense with the anticipation, but heavy with the smell of the cordite and the ash. You have seen the orbital sovereignty, the biological divergence, and the subversive war of the Shadow Marshal. The lore of Killzone has shifted from the surprise of the attack to the sovereignty of the resistance. You realize that the planet is dying. You look at the orange glow of the enemy eyes, knowing that you are finally the only barrier to the extinction. The Golden Age is a red sky over a gray world, and you are the only power left to shatter the mask of the Helghast. The descent into the Vektan jungles and the expansion of the theater of operations introduces the lore of the primal conflict of the colony. As the ISA survivors retreat into the deep foliage to bypass the Helghast blockade, the environment shifts from urban order to biological anarchy, representing the environmental sovereignty of the terrestrial chaos. The lore suggests that Vekta was engineered for the comfort, but the jungle remains the unconquered spirit of the planet. For the squad, this is the lore of the deconstruction of the military form. They find that the clean uniforms and ISA technology are fettered by the vines and the mud, representing the atmospheric sovereignty of the wild. This is the lore of the green purgatory, where the soldier must regress to the hunter to survive the industrialized predator. It proves that the colonial dream is fragile, turning the rainforest canopy into a casket of the civilized illusion. The encounter with Gregor Haka and the revelation of the Helghast half-breed provides the lore of the genetic schism of the loyalty. Haka, a Helghast intelligence officer of pure human appearance, represents the biological sovereignty of the in-between. His lore is defined by the sovereignty of the double agent. He belongs to neither the Helghan nor the Vekta, representing the existential sovereignty of the hybrid. This is the lore of the shattered heritage. It suggests that race is a weapon used by both sides to define the enemy. This represents the intellectual sovereignty of the resistance. The lore of the Haka's defection is the lore of the internal conflict of the soul. He chooses the law over the blood, proving that his sovereignty is moral, turning the squad dynamic into a sacrament of the suspicion, where the enemy becomes the guide. The lore of the Helghast jungle snipers and the shadow infiltration provides the lore of the stealth sovereignty of the guerrilla. The Helghast forces, utilizing active camouflage and silent weaponry, represent the tactical adaptability of the invader. The lore suggests that the exiles have learned to love the dark, representing the predatory sovereignty of the Helghan. This is the lore of the hidden kill zone. It suggests that war is not found in the open, but in the silence of the leaves. This represents the clandestine sovereignty of the Lente. The lore of the sniper is the lore of the invisible death. You must see the unseen to keep your life, proving that your sovereignty is perceptual. This highlights the paranoid nature of the jungle war, turning the crossing of the bridge into a sacrament of the vigilance, where the hero is hunted by the shadow. The introduction of General Lente and the doctrine of the total annihilation provides the lore of the brutal paternity of the conquest. Lente, the field commander of the invasion, represents the physical sovereignty of the Helghast might. His lore is defined by the sovereignty of the Iron Fist. He does not negotiate, he erases, representing the strategic sovereignty of the Visari. This is the lore of the colonial executioner. It suggests that Vekta is not a battlefield, but a crime scene waiting to happen. This represents the totalitarian sovereignty of the occupation. The lore of the Lente's command is the lore of the arrogance of the victor. It reminds the ISA that they are soft and undeserving of the stars, proving that your sovereignty is measured in the iron, turning the jungle base into a sacrament of the might, where the law is subject to the strength. The presence of the ancient Vektan ruins provides the lore of the archaeological sovereignty of the failure. Finding the shattered temples of the original indigenous inhabitants represents the historical sovereignty of the displacement. The lore suggests that the humanity is just the latest invader on a planet of the ghosts. This is the lore of the cyclical extinction. It suggests that victory is temporary, and the land eventually eats the conqueror. This represents the elemental sovereignty of the Vekta. The lore of the ruins is the lore of the silent warning. It reminds the player that stones outlast states, proving that your sovereignty is fleeting. This highlights the melancholic nature of the conflict, turning the firefight in the temple into a sacrament of the forgotten, where the soldiers fight over dirt that has already seen the end. The lore of the Helghast leech technology introduces the lore of the parasitic sovereignty of the resource theft. The Helghast deploy mobile extraction units to strip the Vekta of its energy, representing the industrial sovereignty of the colonial rape. The lore suggests that the invasion is a mining operation disguised as a war, representing the economic sovereignty of the Helghan. This is the lore of the mechanical hunger. It suggests that the exile is starving and the Vekta is the meal. This represents the capitalist sovereignty of the Visari. The lore of the leech is the lore of the draining of the life. It bleeds the planet to fuel the fleet, proving that your sovereignty is logistical. This highlights the desperate nature of the enemy, turning the sabotage mission into a sacrament of the preservation, where the hero must cut the vein to save the heart. For the Haka of the jungle era, the world is the testing of the racial integrity. You realize that the world is defined by the goggles. The lore suggests that Haka is the truth in the mask. You are the only mind that understands the language of the killer while sharing the blood of the victim. The jungle is not a maze. It is a testing ground of the allegiance that you must navigate with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the saving of Templar so complex. You are betraying your species to save your humanity. You look at the Helghast sigil, knowing that it is the only mark that the history has left to birth the hate. The Golden Age is a whisper in the dark, and you are the only note left to signal the end of the Lente's ambition. As this second segment of the history concludes, the squad stands at the edge of the marshlands, the jungle humming with the movement of the Helghast. Behind lies the primal conflict of the colony. Before stands the swamps of the Vekta and the betrayal of the High Command. The air is no longer tense with the foliage, but heavy with the smell of the stagnant water and the treason. You have seen the genetic schism, the doctrine of the total annihilation, and the historical sovereignty of the displacement. The lore of Killzone has shifted from the sovereignty of the resistance to the sovereignty of the treachery. You realize that the traitor is closer than the enemy. You look at the mist on the water, knowing that you are finally the only truth in a world of the masks. The Golden Age is a gray fog over a green hell, and you are the only hand left to expose the heart of the traitor. The trek through the Vektan marshlands and the desperate defense of the shoreline introduces the lore of the stagnant purgatory of the ISA defense. As the squad moves through the waist-deep waters and rotting mangroves, The environment represents the decaying sovereignty of the colonial infrastructure. The lore suggests that the marshes are the waste bin of the Vekta, where the beauty of the planet turns into a clutching mud that consumes the machines of war, representing the geological sovereignty of the swamp. For Templar and his squad, this is the lore of the loss of the high ground. They find that the Helghast hovercraft and respirator technology give the enemy a sovereign advantage in the filth, representing the amphibious sovereignty of the invader. This is the lore of the sinking resistance, where the soldier must fight the gravity of the planet as much as the bullet of the enemy, turning the marshland path into a casket of the logistics. The siege of the ISA coastal base provides the lore of the industrialized slaughter of the garrison. This base, intended to be a shield of the sea, represents the defensive sovereignty of the old world. The lore suggests that the ISA relied too heavily on concrete and turrets, while the Helghast utilized atmospheric superiority and waves of conscripts, representing the asymmetrical sovereignty of the Visari. This is the lore of the breach of the threshold. It suggests that safety is an illusion of the architecture. This represents the surgical sovereignty of the Lente. The lore of the coastal massacre is the lore of the end of the professional soldier. You find the broken bodies of the young recruits who believed in the uniform, proving that your sovereignty is the only weapon left to avenge the innocents, turning the burning ramparts into a sacrament of the vengeance. The encounter with the Helghast elites provides the lore of the apex soldiers of the Helghan. These troops, distinguished by their intricate mask designs and superior ballistic armor, represent the tactical sovereignty of the chosen few. Their lore is defined by the sovereignty of the indoctrination. They are not drafted. They are forged in the fire of the Helghan's toxic wastes, representing the biological sovereignty of the superiority. This is the lore of the unflinching executioner. It suggests that the virus of the fascism has reached its final form in these men. This represents the elite sovereignty of the state. The lore of the elite duel is the lore of the wall of the lead. You must outthink the machine to break the line, proving that your sovereignty is instinctual. This highlights the terrifying precision of the enemy, turning the mud-caked trenches into a sacrament of the reflex. The lore of the Helghast Maw artillery introduces the lore of the auditory sovereignty of the terror. Throughout the marshes, the thump of the heavy long-range cannons creates a rhythm of the death, representing the ballistic sovereignty of the siege. The lore suggests that the Helghast do not fight for the ground. They liquidate the space, representing the industrial sovereignty of the Scholar Visari. This is the lore of the erasure of the horizon. It suggests that distance is no longer a protection. This represents the technological sovereignty of the Lente. The lore of the Maw is the lore of the falling earth. It turns the sky into a hammer to shatter the will of the defender, proving that your sovereignty is small under the weight of the shells. This highlights the overwhelming power of the invader, turning the swamp trek into a sacrament of the endurance. The lore of the abandoned ISA biolabs provides the lore of the ethical erosion of the Vekta. Finding the secret research hidden in the marshes reveals that the ISA was developing the toxins to kill the Helghast biology, representing the chemical sovereignty of the biowarfare. The lore suggests that the democracy was preparing the genocide before the dictatorship arrived, representing the hypocritical sovereignty of the High Command. This is the lore of the mirror of the sin. It suggests that war turns the doctor into a sacrament of the plague. This represents the scientific sovereignty of the fear. The lore of the biolab is the lore of the poison truth. It reminds the player that moral superiority is the first casualty of the survival, proving that your sovereignty is tainted, turning the laboratory investigation into a sacrament of the disillusionment. The presence of the Luger stealth doctrine in the marshlands provides the lore of the subversive sovereignty of the ghost. In the narrow, foggy waterways, the shadow marshal becomes the apex predator, representing the asymmetrical sovereignty of the infiltration. The lore suggests that one woman can undo the work of 1,000 soldiers if she owns the dark. This is the lore of the silent liberation. It suggests that power is vulnerable at the throat. This represents the assassination sovereignty of the Vekta. The lore of the Luger path is the lore of the ripple in the water. You must kill without the sound to protect the loud, proving that your sovereignty is subtle. This highlights the vampiric nature of the guerrilla war, turning the mist-covered bayou into a sacrament of the predation. For the Rico of the Marsh era, the world is the testing of the heavy resolve. You realize that the world is sinking in the blood. The lore suggests that Rico is the anchor in the mud. You are the only shield that stops the advance, while the water clogs the gears. The marsh is not a place. It is a gravity of the death that you must resist with your very muscle. This perspective is what makes the defense of the base so personal. You are becoming the wall to save the cowards. You look at the dead ISA recruits, knowing that they are the only cost that the High Command is willing to pay. The Golden Age is a red glow of the overheating barrel, and you are the only heat left to boil the Helghast in their own water. As this third segment of the history concludes, the squad stands at the gate of the mountain pass, the marshland echoing with the screams of the dying coastal guard. Behind lies the stagnant purgatory of the ISA defense. Before stands the frozen heights of the Vekta and the final duel with General Lente. The air is no longer tense with the humidity, but cold with the certainty of the endgame. You have seen the industrialized slaughter, the apex soldiers of the Helghan, and the ethical erosion of the Vekta. The lore of Killzone has shifted from the sovereignty of the treachery to the sovereignty of the attrition. You realize that the traitor Adams is watching. You look at the snow on the peaks, knowing that you are finally the final storm of the Vekta. The Golden Age is a black smoke over a white mountain, and you are the only flame left to ignite the heart of the resistance. The ascent into the Vektan mountain peaks and the breach of the high-altitude Helghast fortifications introduces the lore of the vertical sovereignty of the Helghan siege. As the squad climbs above the clouds, the environment shifts from biological decay to mechanical isolation, representing the atmospheric sovereignty of the predator. The lore suggests that the Helghast feel at home in the thin air and freezing temperatures, as it mirrors the hostile skies of Helghan, representing the extraterrestrial sovereignty of the exiles. For Templar, this climb is the lore of the thinning of the hope. He finds that the geography is the final ally of the invader. This is the lore of the frozen purgatory, where the soldier must fight the oxygen deprivation as much as the Helghast sniper, turning the mountain pass into a casket of the high-altitude logistics. The clash with the Helghast airborne and the jetpack units provides the lore of the gravity-defying supremacy of the Helghan. These specialized troops, soaring over the precipices to drop grenades into the ISA ranks, represent the aerial sovereignty of the Blitzkrieg. Their lore is defined by the sovereignty of the high ground. It suggests that the Helghast have conquered the sky to look down on the humanity, representing the technological sovereignty of the Visari. This is the lore of the descending death. It suggests that cover is useless when the enemy attacks from the zenith. This represents the kinetic sovereignty of the Lente. The lore of the airborne skirmish is the lore of the battle for the horizon. You must shoot the sky to stay on the ground, proving that your sovereignty is grounded and resilient. The infiltration of the mountain fortress provides the lore of the industrialized paranoia of the occupation. This massive structure, carved directly into the Vektan stone, represents the architectural sovereignty of the Iron Fist. The lore suggests that the Helghast do not inhabit a planet, they fortify it, representing the structural sovereignty of the Scholar Visari. This is the lore of the stone grave. It suggests that freedom is erased by the concrete. This represents the totalitarian sovereignty of the masonry. The lore of the fortress interior is the lore of the geometry of the control. You find the holding cells for the Vektan dissidents, proving that your sovereignty is the only key left to open the prison, turning the industrial corridors into a sacrament of the liberation. The final confrontation with General Lente provides the lore of the violent conclusion of the field command. In the heart of the mountain, the squad finally corners the architect of the Vektan ground invasion, representing the physical sovereignty of the retribution. Lente's lore is defined by the sovereignty of the disdain. Even at the end, He views the ISA as weaklings who stole the wealth of the stars, representing the political sovereignty of the Helghast grievance. This is the lore of the dying general. It suggests that hatred is a fuel that burns out the engine. This represents the mortal sovereignty of the autocracy. The lore of the Lente's death is the lore of the decapitation of the army. You realize that killing the man does not stop the machine, but it shatters the ego of the Helghan, turning the control room into a sacrament of the execution. The lore of the Helghast heavy units, the massive shielded troopers, provides the lore of the unstoppable momentum of the fascism. These soldiers, encased in impervious plating and carrying rotary cannons, represent the ballistic sovereignty of the Helghan might. Their lore suggests that the individual has been replaced by the tank, representing the dehumanized sovereignty of the warfare. This is the lore of the walking wall. It suggests that pain is irrelevant to the will of the state. This represents the industrial sovereignty of the muscle. The lore of the heavy encounter is the lore of the irresistible force. You must find the gap in the steel to find the heart, proving that your sovereignty is analytical. This highlights the gritty nature of the combat, turning the fortress bridge into a sacrament of the grit. The lore of the ISA shadow network and the transmission of the treason introduces the lore of the informational sovereignty of the atoms. Throughout the fortress, the discovery of encrypted comms proves that General Adams has been feeding the ISA positions to the Helghast, representing the traitorous sovereignty of the High Command. The lore suggests that the front line was sold before the first shot was fired, representing the economic sovereignty of the betrayal. This is the lore of the mercenary general. It suggests that loyalty is a commodity. This represents the cynical sovereignty of the Vekta. The lore of the atom signal is the lore of the knife in the back. It nullifies the valor of the dead soldiers, proving that your sovereignty is the only record of the truth. For the Luger of the Mountain era, the world is the testing of the infiltration integrity. You realize that the world is being sealed in the iron. The lore suggests that Luger is the ghost in the machine. You are the only blade that cuts the wires before the trap is sprung. The mountain is not a peak. It is a mechanical spine of the war that you must snap with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the assassination of the guards so cold. You are becoming the shadow to bring the light. You look at the Helghast blueprints, knowing that they are the only maps that the history has left to redefine the Vekta. The Golden Age is a red on the general's head, and you are the only sight left to focus the rage of the Republic. As this fourth segment of the history concludes, the squad stands over the body of General Lente, the fortress shaking with the sound of the orbital bombardment. Behind lies the vertical sovereignty of the siege. Before stands the space station of the atoms and the final ascent into the stars. The air is no longer tense with the cold, but heavy with the smell of the burning electronics and the treason. You have seen the jetpack supremacy, the industrialized paranoia, and the violent conclusion of the command. The lore of Killzone has shifted from the sovereignty of the attrition to the sovereignty of the orbital truth. You realize that the traitor is above. You look at the stars, knowing that you are finally the only force of the gravity. The Golden Age is a rocket trail against the night, and you are the only hand left to pull the traitor from the sky. The breach of the orbital strategic defense, SD platforms, and the final ascent into the vacuum introduces the lore of the celestial sovereignty of the colonial shield. As the squad boards the massive space station, the environment transitions from terrestrial warfare to cosmic claustrophobia, representing the technological sovereignty of the High Command. The lore suggests that these platforms were designed to be the eyes and fists of the Vekta, but they have become a mechanical guillotine held over the planet's neck, representing the orbital sovereignty of the sabotage. For Templar, this mission is the lore of the assault on the heaven. He finds that the defense of the Republic is now being used to murder the Republic. This is the lore of the Steel Gallows, where the soldier must reclaim the sky to save the Earth, turning the docking bays into a sacrament of the vacuum. The duel with General Adams provides the lore of the treasonous hubris of the high rank. Adams, the man who sold Vekta to the Helghast, represents the moral decay of the ISA leadership. His lore is defined by the sovereignty of the pragmatic betrayal. He does not view himself as a traitor, but as a realist who saw the Helghast as the inevitable future, representing the cynical sovereignty of the collaboration. This is the lore of the general's cowardice. It suggests that power is a currency that Adams spent to buy his survival. This represents the bureaucratic sovereignty of the sin. The lore of the Adams' final stand is the lore of the shattered glass. He hides behind automated turrets and Helghast guards, proving that his sovereignty is artificial and dependent, turning the command bridge into a sacrament of the judgment. The activation of the strategic defense platforms provides the lore of the automated genocide of the Vekta. As the platforms are turned against the Helghast invasion fleet, it represents the mechanical sovereignty of the turning tide. The lore suggests that the laser does not distinguish between the soldier and the civilian, representing the indiscriminate sovereignty of the orbital strike. This is the lore of the light of the retribution. It suggests that salvation comes in the form of a beam that boils the atmosphere. This represents the pyrotechnic sovereignty of the defense. The lore of the SD activation is the lore of the scorched sky. You must input the codes to burn the invader, proving that your sovereignty is decisive. This highlights the terrifying scale of the solar warfare, turning the console interface into a sacrament of the purge. The lore of the Helghast leech infiltration pods provides the lore of the invasive sovereignty of the steel teeth. These pods, designed to bite into the hull of the station and vomit Helghast shock troops, represent the violent sovereignty of the boarding party. Their lore is defined by the sovereignty of the breach. It suggests that the Helghast are like a parasite that enters the brain of the ISA, representing the biological sovereignty of the machine. This is the lore of the inner nightmare. It suggests that metal is no protection against the will of the Visari. This represents the industrial sovereignty of the boarding. The lore of the leech encounter is the lore of the fight for the airlock. You must seal the holes to keep the vacuum out, proving that your sovereignty is containment. The presence of the Lente's ghost and the Helghast remnants introduces the lore of the fanaticism of the bereaved army. Despite the death of their general, the Helghast on the station fight with a suicidal intensity, representing the martyrdom sovereignty of the cult. The lore suggests that Visari has infected the mind deeper than Lente ever could, representing the spiritual sovereignty of the Helghan state. This is the lore of the unending grudge. It suggests that victory for the Helghast is not a strategy, but a religious necessity. This represents the psychological sovereignty of the goggles. The lore of the final wave is the lore of the blood on the steel. It forces the squad to exhaust their ammo on zombies of the ideology, proving that your sovereignty is the only sanity left in the orbit, turning the station corridors into a sacrament of the fanaticism. The lore of the Adams logic and the future of the Vekta provides the lore of the philosophical defeat of the colony. In his final moments, Adams warns that the ISA is just as bloody as the Helghast, representing the nihilistic sovereignty of the truth. The lore suggests that Earth does not care for Vekta, only for the resources, representing the imperial sovereignty of the UCN. This is the lore of the orphaned colony. It suggests that the war is just a dispute between two monsters. This represents the geopolitical sovereignty of the Centauri. The lore of the Adams death rattle is the lore of the warning of the traitor. It infects the victory with the shadow of the doubt, proving that your sovereignty is isolated. This highlights the grim reality of the Killzone, turning the ending of the station into a sacrament of the abandonment. For the Templar of the orbital era, the world is the testing of the strategic resolve. You realize that the world is being saved by a monster's weapon. The lore suggests that Jan is the captain of the falling star. You are the only mind that commands the laser to save the soil. The station is not a building, it is a mechanical eye of the storm that you must blink with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the killing of Adams so weightless. You are executing the treason in the zero gravity. You look at the Vekta below, knowing that it is the only beauty that the war has left to tarnish. The Golden Age is a flash of the SD beam, and you are the only hand left to signal the end of the Helghast landing. As this fifth segment of the history concludes, the squad stands on the observation deck, the Helghast fleet burning in the Vektan atmosphere. Behind lies the duel with the General Atoms. Before stands the destruction of the station and the escape to the surface. The air is no longer tense with the oxygen, but thin with the smell of the ozone and the metal. You have seen the assault on the heaven, the automated genocide, and the treasonous hubris of the rank. The lore of Killzone has shifted from the sovereignty of the orbital truth to the sovereignty of the burning sky. You realize that the war is not over. You look at the Helghan star in the distance, knowing that you are finally the first soldier of the retaliation. The Golden Age is a debris field in the dark, and you are the only life left to fall back to the Earth. The destruction of the SD platform and the plummet through the Vektan atmosphere introduces the lore of the incendiary rebirth of the colony. As the space station disintegrates under the weight of the Helghast sabotage and the ISA's own counterfire, the sky itself becomes a graveyard of shattered ambition, representing the orbital sovereignty of the ruin. The lore suggests that the shield of Vekta had to fall so the people of Vekta could finally see the face of the enemy without the filter of the technology. For Templar and his squad, this descent is the lore of the re-entry of the survivor. They are no longer colonial defenders, but scars of the conflict falling back to a world that has been purified by the fire. This is the lore of the falling star, where the soldier becomes the sacrament of the gravity, proving that the ISA's orbital dream was a mechanical hubris, turning the upper atmosphere into a casket of the Iron Peace. The landing on the reclaimed Vekta provides the lore of the ash-covered victory of the ISA. Touching down in the ruins of the capital, the squad finds a world that is free but broken, representing the bittersweet sovereignty of the reclamation. The lore suggests that winning is merely the right to bury the dead, representing the melancholic sovereignty of the victor. This is the lore of the silent liberation. It suggests that the Helghast did not just invade the land, they polluted the future. This represents the sociological sovereignty of the trauma. The lore of the reclaimed city is the lore of the static horizon. You look at the broken skyscrapers and realize they are tombstones of the old way, proving that your sovereignty is survivor's guilt, turning the city square into a sacrament of the mourning. The lore of the Helghast withdrawal and the orderly retreat provides the lore of the tactical patience of the autocracy. Even in defeat, the Helghast do not flee, they regroup with a terrifying discipline, representing the resilient sovereignty of the Helghan state. The lore suggests that the invasion of Vekta was never meant to be a permanent occupation, but a statement of the capability, representing the psychological sovereignty of the Visari. This is the lore of the wound that stays open. It suggests that the exile has tasted the blood and will return for the meal. This represents the strategic sovereignty of the hatred. The lore of the withdrawal is the lore of the looming shadow. It reminds the ISA that peace is just the reloading of the weapons, proving that your sovereignty is temporary. The prophetic warning of Scholar Visari provides the lore of the oratory infection of the solar system. Through the final broadcast intercepted by the ISA, the voice of the Helghan declares that the war has only just begun, representing the philosophical sovereignty of the fascism. His lore is defined by the sovereignty of the victimhood. He paints the ISA as the oppressors and the Helghast as the righteous sword of the outcast, representing the ideological sovereignty of the great leader. This is the lore of the master race narrative. It suggests that truth is whatever the strongest man says. This represents the totalitarian sovereignty of the rhetoric. The lore of the Visari speech is the lore of the spark of the Helghan War. It infects the future with the promise of the retaliation, turning the victory celebration into a sacrament of the dread. The presence of the Haka paradox and the future of the hybrid provides the lore of the genetic uncertainty of the peace. Haka, surviving the war, represents the bridge that no one wants to cross, representing the existential sovereignty of the half-breed. The lore suggests that Vekta will never trust a face, that reminds them of the goggles, representing the paranoid sovereignty of the survivor. This is the lore of the internal exile. It suggests that the hybrid is the only one who truly sees the horror of both sides. This represents the intellectual sovereignty of the outcast. The lore of Haka's survival is the lore of the warning of the DNA. It proves that the war has changed the species, turning the post-war bureaucracy into a sacrament of the alienation, where the hero is a reminder of the enemy. The final assessment of the SAT Special Assault Team provides the lore of the fragmented unity of the Republic. As the four heroes go their separate ways, the lore reveals that the bond of the combat is the only thing that held the Vekta together, representing the fragile sovereignty of the Alliance. This is the lore of the disbanding of the Shield. It suggests that Chris, Rico, Luger, and Haka are four different versions of the pain, representing the psychological sovereignty of the warzone. The lore of the SAT legacy is the lore of the soldiers of the next war. It reminds the player that Killzone 1 was the birth of the heroes who would one day invade Helghan, proving that your sovereignty is cyclical. This highlights the tragic continuity of the series, turning the final scene into a sacrament of the prologue. For the Templar of the ending, the world is the testing of the narrative closure. You realize that the world is preparing for the next fire. The lore suggests that Jan is the keeper of the temporary peace. You are the only mind that sees the Helghan fleet in the dreams of the reclaimed Vekta. The victory is not a holiday, it is a ceasefire that you must uphold with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the filing of the report so hollow. You are saving a planet that is already planning the revenge. You look at the orange glow of the sunset, knowing that it looks too much like the eyes of the Helghast. The Golden Age is a silence of the artillery, and you are the only sound left to warn the world of the coming storm. As the sixth and final segment of the history concludes, the squad stands on the Vektan Ridge, the stars beginning to taint the twilight. Behind lies the destruction of the SD station. Before stands the invasion of Helghan and the infinite agony of the Killzone 2. The air is no longer tense with the smoke, but charged with the certainty of the retaliation. You have seen the atomic rebirth, the tactical patience of the state, and the prophetic warning of the Visari. The lore of Killzone has shifted from the sovereignty of the burning sky to the sovereignty of the eternal war. You realize that the Vekta is safe for now, but the Helghast are coming home. You look at the night sky, knowing that you are finally the first martyr of the interplanetary crusade. The Golden Age is a breath before the plunge, and you are the only light left to guide the ISA into the heart of the Helghan.